Billie Holiday's story is not one for the faint of heart. As one of the most influential voices in jazz, Holiday, known as Lady Day, captivated the world with her unique phrasing and raw emotion. But behind her iconic voice and unforgettable songs, like the haunting Strange Fruit, was a life marked by scandal, racism, and a constant battle with inner demons. Now, 65 years after her death, shocking new revelations are coming to light, with her family confirming some of the most heartbreaking rumors about her final years. Billie's tragic tale, filled with legal troubles and addiction, has always left fans wondering, did she get the justice and peace she deserved? Join us as we uncover the truth behind the rumors and dive deeper into the dark story of a woman who was taken from us far too soon. Billie Holiday's tragic end was foreshadowed by a life filled with hardship and turmoil from the very start. Born in 1915, her mother, Sadie Harris, was a teenager when she became pregnant. Kicked out of her family home in Baltimore, Sadie fled to Philadelphia, where Billie was born. On the birth certificate, Sadie listed a man named Frank DeVries as Billie's father, but he quickly vanished from their lives. The truth, however, was much darker. Billie's real father was Clarence Holiday, a teenage banjo player, but by the time Billie was born, the damage was done. Her mother's brother-in-law took Billie, then named Eleonora, straight to Baltimore, where she was raised by his mother, and that marked the beginning of a painful journey. Billie's relationship with her mother was strained from the start. For much of her childhood, Sadie was absent, and when she did re-enter Billie's life, things only seemed to get worse. After moving in with her mother, Billie found herself in trouble with the law, landing her in reform school for 10 months due to lack of proper guardianship. Tragically, her troubles didn't end there. A horrific assault by a neighbor led to her return to reform school, where she spent another 2 months. It took the relentless efforts of a determined lawyer to secure her release. In 1928, Billie's mother, Sadie, left her once again, this time to move to New York City. Despite their fractured relationship, Billie decided to follow her a year later. What seemed like a fresh start turned out to be a life-altering decision, but it began with a painful mistake. Billie, now a teenager, joined her mother in a night house, a place where Sadie worked the streets. Eventually, the authorities raided the house, and both mother and daughter were detained. After being convicted of prostitution, Billie was sent to Welfare Island, where she spent 5 months working in the workhouse before being released. She returned to her mother, but in the process, something inside her began to shift. Her time in the house of ill repute exposed her to a harsh reality, but it also introduced her to something that would change her life forever: jazz. As Billie began singing in nightclubs, she quickly gained a following, and it was through her music that she unexpectedly reconnected with her estranged father, Clarence Holiday, a fellow musician. The world of jazz became Billie's escape, but her journey was far from easy. Despite her immense talent, her upbringing had made her tough, independent, and unafraid to stand her ground. Billie had learned early on that people would take advantage of her, whether because of her youth, her gender, or her race, and she made it her mission to avoid being exploited. But her fierce determination also came with a cost. While her distinctive voice captivated audiences, it also earned her a fair share of enemies as she fought to carve out her place in the unforgiving world of music. Billie's big break came when her agent landed her a coveted gig at the Grand Terrace in Chicago, but what should have been a dream opportunity quickly turned into chaos. After the theater manager asked her to speed up the tempo of her performance, Billie lost her temper, leading to a violent altercation where she threw a heavy inkwell at his head. She was promptly fired, but true to Billie's nature, she got her revenge. Years later, when she was one of the hottest names in jazz, the same manager begged her to return to the Grand Terrace. In typical Billie fashion, she turned him down without hesitation, telling him she wouldn't perform there if it were the last venue on earth. Billie didn't forget the wrongs done to her, and when she had the power, she wasn't afraid to speak her mind. However, her boldness often came with a price. One night in March, just before a performance, Billie received a chilling phone call that would shake her to her core. The person on the other end informed her that her father, Clarence Holliday, had passed away a week earlier in Texas, and his death was tragic. Clarence had fallen ill while on tour, but due to racial discrimination, he couldn't find a hospital to treat him. By the time he made it to a veterans hospital with a segregated Jim Crow wing, it was too late. Despite their strained relationship, Billie had always looked up to Clarence, and his death left her devastated. Though life had knocked her down time and again, Billie somehow found the strength to keep going. By the time she was 16, Billie had already faced countless painful experiences with men, but then she met Bobby Henderson. The two young musicians quickly fell for each other, and their bond seemed perfect. They were even rumored to be engaged, but their love story came to a tragic end. In 1932, the news broke that Billie and Bobby had separated. It was a heartbreaking blow for both, but Bobby's reaction was even more perplexing. The day after the breakup, he was supposed to record with Billie's producer, but he never showed up. He then changed his name and vanished from the jazz scene for 2 decades. For her part, Billie dealt with the breakup in a classic way, with a terrible rebound, of course. Billie's friends had hoped she'd end up with someone stable, like Bobby Henderson or pianist Sonny White. But instead, her next choice was Jimmy Monroe, a man with ties to the notorious gangster Dutch Schultz. Monroe's connections were troubling enough, but it wasn't just his criminal ties that caused concern. He was a hustler with a dangerous taste for opium and coke, and he quickly introduced Billie to the same deadly habits. As we'll see, these addictions would have disastrous consequences for her. But drugs weren't the only challenge Billie faced at this point in her career. She briefly sang for Count Basie's band, but was fired for being temperamental. While that might sound like a simple excuse, there's more to the story. It seems the band resented Billie for standing up for herself. She voiced complaints about low pay, poor working conditions, and the exhausting tour schedule. Sure, those were serious issues, but they didn't even compare to what would come next. Billie's next big move was with clarinetist Artie Shaw. Shaw needed a way to elevate his band, and Billie came up with a bold suggestion: hire a black singer for his all-white orchestra. And of course, the singer she had in mind was herself. It was a groundbreaking move, but Shaw, who had experienced his own share of prejudice as a Jewish musician, was willing to take the risk. Neither of them could have foreseen the storm that their professional collaboration would stir up. Billie Holiday wasn't stupid. She knew that performing with Artie Shaw's band in the segregated South would stir up controversy. To minimize the backlash, she tried to keep a low profile on tour. But the constant reminders of the racial divide still took a toll on her. Separate entrances, sitting alone in a room away from the band when she wasn't performing. It was dehumanizing. But the final straw came when the owner of the Lincoln Hotel in New York City, a place where Billie had lived and performed for years, tried to pull the same stunt. That was the breaking point for her. Enduring that kind of treatment in the South was one thing, but when it happened in New York, it was too much. Billie had teamed up with Artie Shaw to make a name for themselves in jazz, only to have their ambitions constantly thwarted. Their record labels were feuding, and that hotel incident pushed her to leave the band. It was a crushing decision, but one that brought with it a painful realization. Her style of singing didn't fit the era. The swing movement was all about big, fast, loud tunes with a full band. Billie's voice, with its sparse arrangements and slower tempos, was something entirely different. It was then, during her time with Artie Shaw, that she understood she'd never be a commercial sensation. Frustrated and disillusioned, she turned to substances to numb the pain, and as always, her toxic boyfriend Jimmy Monroe was more than willing to enable her. Realizing she'd never be a commercial sensation was a tough blow for Billie. but it also gave her a sense of freedom she hadn't had before. Without the pressure to conform to what others expected, she could finally perform and record songs that truly showcased her extraordinary voice. This newfound freedom led her to a song that would change her life and the world forever, the iconic and controversial Strange Fruit. Although many associate the song with Billie Holiday, it wasn't her original work. Strange Fruit started as a poem written by Abel Meeropol, a Jewish schoolteacher, in response to the rampant lynchings in America. When Billie read it, she immediately thought of her father, whose tragic death was tied to racism. In 1939, she turned the poem into a haunting song. At first, she had no idea just how profound an impact it would have. Billie performed Strange Fruit for the first time at Cafe Society in New York City, but she feared the violent reactions it might provoke, and she wasn't the only one. Her record label, Columbia, refused to record it, worried about the backlash they'd face from stores and affiliates in the South. But Billie wasn't about to back down. She found another label willing to record the song, forcing Columbia to make an exception to her contract just for that one track. The effect was immediate. Strange Fruit became a protest song like no other. Its chilling, somber tone didn't stir its audience to action, but froze them in place. Soon, activists working on an anti-lynching campaign were sending copies of the record to congressmen. Critics feared it would incite even more violence, and some venues even tried to pressure Billie not to perform it. But Billie was no stranger to defiance, and she wasn't about to back down now. New performance contracts started to include clauses ensuring her right to sing the controversial song, a victory that came with a cost. Strange Fruit brought Billie not just acclaim but fame, publicity, and, for the first time, substantial money. Unfortunately, most of that money went toward supporting her and Jimmy Monroe's deepening addiction. Their relationship also sparked major tension with Billie's mother, Sadie, who, despite her own struggles, saw Jimmy for the manipulative person he was. Finally, Sadie had enough and kicked Jimmy out. But Billie, ever the rebel, didn't take that well. The very next day, she returned to her mother's house, marriage certificate in hand. She'd married Jimmy the night before. Sadie was heartbroken, and Billie left with her new husband, finding a place of their own. What should have been a honeymoon turned into an even worse ordeal when Jimmy was arrested and sentenced to 12 months for marijuana possession. Billie initially tried to fight for him, hiring lawyers, but soon everything began to unravel. She began to realize the truth about Jimmy. Maybe it was the time apart, or the fact that he skipped town for California and started seeing other women. Whatever it was, Billie wasted no time moving on from him and into yet another troubled relationship. This time, it was with Joe Guy, yes, really, a man who didn't share Jimmy's infidelity, but did share his love for substances. And boy problems weren't the only ones weighing her down. Strange Fruit had catapulted Billie into the limelight, but with her limited education, having dropped out of school at just 11, she wasn't interested in engaging in politics. That said, she wasn't about to back down from confronting racism. One day, when a naval officer spat a racial slur at her, Billie didn't hesitate. She smashed a glass bottle on a table and brandished it in his face. The message was clear: mess with Billie Holiday at your own risk. Unfortunately, not everyone got the memo. As Billie started earning more from her music, she wanted to share her success. According to one friend, she fed everybody in New York for about 4 years. But for Billie, family always came first. She used her earnings to bankroll a restaurant for her mother, Sadie, a decision that backfired quickly. Billie had to keep lending her mother more money, and when Billie hit tough times, Sadie's response was harsh. Sadie refused to give Billie a single cent. Their argument escalated into one of their biggest fights, one that, tragically, would be one of the last. Sadie had once said that watching Billie spiral into addiction would likely lead to her own early death. For a while, it seemed like Billie might prove her wrong. She went through detox treatments, but just when things seemed to be looking up, everything unraveled. In 1945, Sadie passed away, and the grief was overwhelming. Sadly, it pushed Billie back into her old habits. In 1946, Billie was cast in the Hollywood film New Orleans, alongside Louis Armstrong. It was supposed to be a dream come true, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. Racism and the Hollywood Red Scare forced the filmmakers to cut nearly all of Billie and Louis's footage, diminishing the role that black artists played in shaping jazz music. It was a complete disaster, made worse by Billie's struggles on set. Billie was deep in the grips of addiction while making New Orleans, still struggling with the loss of her mother. She was burning through her $1,000 per week salary as soon as it came in, but that wasn't even the most heartbreaking part. Her boyfriend, Joe Guy, had followed her to Los Angeles and was supplying her with drugs. When her manager caught him in the act, he had Joe banned from the set. Unfortunately, the worst was still ahead. Billie's substance abuse soon caught up with her, and the consequences were both devastating and life-altering. She had managed to avoid serious trouble with the authorities for a while, but in 1947, they finally raided her New York City apartment for narcotics possession. To make matters worse, her lawyer didn't even bother to show up to represent her, and she started going through the agonizing withdrawal process. Weak, dehydrated, and desperate, Billie pled guilty and begged to be sent to a hospital, but relief wasn't coming. She was abandoned by her lawyer, mistreated by the authorities, and the situation became so dire that the district attorney actually pleaded with the judge on her behalf. It was almost unimaginable. In the end, the judge sentenced Billie to a federal women's prison camp, but the consequences didn't stop there. She also lost her cabaret license in New York, meaning she could no longer perform in venues that served alcohol. It was a crushing blow to her career, one that would take a monumental effort to recover from. After spending nearly a year behind bars, Billie was released early for good behavior. She returned home, where a friend and her dog were waiting for her at the airport. The dog was so happy to see her that it knocked her down, covering her face with kisses. The scene caused a commotion, with a bystander mistakenly thinking the dog was attacking her and screaming, which led to a crowd gathering, followed by a swarm of reporters. Billie was back, but she couldn't shake the fear that people would never forgive her for her mistakes. Billie Holiday was always fiercely herself, but beneath that tough exterior, she carried a constant anxiety about being judged for her personal struggles. At least for a while, she didn't have much to fear. Her manager convinced a hesitant Billie to do a comeback show at Carnegie Hall, and it immediately shattered records for advance ticket sales. The performance itself was unforgettable. During the show, an audience member sent a box of white gardenias to the stage, flowers that had once been her signature. Billie picked up a sprig and tucked it into her hair, not realizing that the hat pin had pierced her skin until blood started streaming down her face. The show was a massive success, and the sold-out crowd kept calling for more. After 3 curtain calls, Billie stumbled backstage and collapsed from exhaustion. A brief but successful Broadway run followed, but the shadow of her time in prison still loomed large. Losing her cabaret license had severely impacted her ability to earn, especially when fans were eager to see her perform. With few other options, Billie was forced to go on exhausting tours to make money. The relentless schedule had a devastating consequence. Before long, she had relapsed. The tour quickly spiraled into chaos, with a fight breaking out and another arrest for possession. She managed to get out of it, but the damage had been done. The law was now out to get her, determined to bring her down no matter what. For a brief time, there seemed to be hope when Billie married her second husband, Louis McKay. He didn't have the same problems as her past relationships, and at first, he appeared to be a positive influence. But soon, the darker side of Louis revealed itself. While he helped keep her clean, he also worked as a mob enforcer, draining her finances. The worst part, though, was his abuse. The toll of addiction, the drinking, and the toxic relationships was starting to break Billie down at an alarming rate. During her time with Louis McKay, Billie Holiday endured both physical and emotional abuse. Louis was so violent that she often had to tape up her ribs before performing, just to manage the pain. He also tried to take control of her music, scheming to profit from her work if she were to die. But somehow, that wasn't even the worst of it. Louis was secretly working with her biggest hidden enemy, Harry Anslinger. If you're wondering why the authorities had such a vendetta against Billie when so many other celebrities were using drugs in those post-prohibition days, it's all because of Anslinger. As the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, he spent years trying to take down Billie and other jazz musicians. And it wasn't just about the drugs. When he was made aware of Judy Garland's severe substance issues, he met with her, told her to take some time off, and assured her studio that she wasn't an addict. That's how ruthless and biased this guy was. While Anslinger worked behind the scenes to tear her down, Billie fought to keep her career alive, despite the agony caused by her toxic relationship with Louis. In 1956, she released her autobiography, Lady Sings the Blues, along with an album by the same name. She followed that with more recordings and well-received performances, but balancing it all was a precarious act. Depression was creeping in, forcing Billie to retreat from the world, when disaster struck. In March 1959, she lost one of her oldest friends, Lester Young. Their friendship had been incredibly deep. Lester had given her the nickname Lady Day, and she called him the Prez. The loss was a crushing blow, and it was only made worse by the fact that Billie's request to sing at his funeral was denied by his widow. Heartbroken, Billie still attended the service, where she paid her respects. A friend who accompanied Billie to and from the funeral recalled that afterward she made a chilling remark. "I'll be the next one to go." Sadly, she couldn't have known how right she was. In her final years, Billie Holiday became increasingly paranoid, convinced that government agents were out to get her. Tragically, she was right. After a relapse, she was hospitalized, weak and deteriorating, when a group of federal agents barged into her room, falsely claiming they'd found drugs in her home. Billie had always been a fighter, but by this point, her strength had been completely drained. What followed was a horrifying injustice that has become infamous. After the visit from the agents, a grand jury indicted Billie, and she was arrested and handcuffed to her hospital bed, guarded by police. To make matters worse, Harry Anslinger, her greatest enemy, ordered doctors to stop giving Billie the methadone that had been helping her manage withdrawal symptoms. Many hold Anslinger directly responsible for the events that unfolded. 2 months later, after receiving the last rites from a priest, Billie passed away from complications due to cirrhosis. She was only 44 years old. It was a heartbreaking and unfair end for a woman who had such extraordinary talent, beauty, and deep sorrow. But the cruelty didn't end there. Billie's estranged husband, Louis McKay, who had betrayed and broken her heart during her life, saved his worst betrayal for after her death. When Billie passed, she had just 70 cents in her bank account, with less than $1,000 to her name, thanks in large part to Louis's reckless spending. Worse still, he was in charge of her burial arrangements, and his stinginess knew no bounds. A wealthy fan offered to bury Billie in a prestigious Manhattan cemetery, alongside other celebrities, but Louis refused. Instead, he opted to bury her next to her mother, which might have seemed sweet, but it was far from it. Billie's grave was nothing more than an unmarked patch of dirt, no tombstone, no marker. In 1960, a jazz publication drew attention to the sad state of her resting place, criticizing those who had profited off her music, yet left her at Louis's mercy. They even offered to raise money for a proper tombstone, but Louis, stubborn and prideful, refused. Eventually, he relented and provided a shared tombstone for both Billie and her mother, Sadie. While she may have suffered greatly in her final years, Billie's legacy would eventually rise above the pain. Though her music wasn't fully appreciated in her time, her songs, stripped of all pretense, gained a new level of admiration after her death. Reissues of her albums, Hall of Fame inductions, and statues began to appear, honoring her as one of jazz's greatest voices and one of its most controversial figures. Billie's legacy is now immortalized, and her place in music history is secure. It's tough to distinguish fact from fiction when it comes to Billie Holiday, especially since her own memoir is known to be unreliable. However, one of the most shocking chapters of her life revolves around the circumstances of her infamous arrest for possession. It all started with her relationship with one of the agents involved in her detainment, Jimmy Fletcher. Fletcher had been working undercover to keep tabs on Billie, and while the United States versus Billie Holiday portrays them as having a romantic relationship, there's no real evidence to suggest that was the case. Fletcher later expressed deep regret about how Billie was treated by the agency, but there's more to the story than just that. Billie was a fighter from the start, and she didn't back down when she was arrested. When the agents, including Fletcher, came to detain her, she caused such a scene that it became legendary. She refused to wait for a female officer to arrive for a body search, stripping down in front of the men and even urinating on the floor. In 1956, Billie worked with a ghostwriter to pen her memoir, Lady Sings the Blues, but it stirred up controversy. Many parts of her story were either exaggerated or left out entirely, and the revelations about her love life were so scandalous that multiple Hollywood lawyers reached out to her publisher, demanding their clients' names be removed from the book. Charles Lawton reportedly even threatened to sue, but one particular celebrity was so outraged by the contents of the memoir that she vowed to shut down the publisher entirely. One of Billie Holiday's most intense relationships was with the stunning actress Tallulah Bankhead, and it was nothing short of fiery. Billie's friends said Tallulah was completely captivated by her, even to the point of obsession. But beneath that passion, there was also a deeply caring side to their connection. In 1949, when Billie was arrested and threatening to harm herself, Tallulah stepped in to help by paying for a psychiatrist. But she didn't stop there. Tallulah took it a step further and contacted FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to try to intervene on Billie's behalf. The inclusion of certain people in Billie's tell-all memoir sparked anger, but there was one celebrity who didn't mind being mentioned. Actor and director Orson Welles, who spent time with Billie in the 1940s, had a brief romance with her, but it had a troubling side. Billie received anonymous phone calls threatening her, claiming that she was ruining Welles' career. The caller even went so far as to say that if she didn't end the relationship, she'd be blacklisted from Hollywood. While it's unclear whether the threats came true, it's evident that Billie never quite made it as an actress. However, her legacy as one of the greatest jazz voices of all time is undeniable.